Reading with your kids.
Hola, niho, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moli moli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville, in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show, and please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, Good Pods, Himalaya, Ghana, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Sarah Katherine Mundy. She'll be here to celebrate. Please stay here. I want you near. Before we invite Dr. Sarah into the studio, we want to invite you to visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. I'm really amazed at how much information and resources are available on our website, readingwithyourkids.com. You know, we have been publishing the Reading with Your Kids podcast since 2017. And over that time, we've amassed a wealth of information. Of course, you can go to our Certified Great Reads page to find all the different books that have become Certified Great Reads over the years. You can also check out our blog to see some great interviews, some great author profiles, some great recipes you can do with your kids. And you can also find our Drawing with Your Kids page at readingwithyourkids.com. Learn how to draw some beautiful characters from some of the best illustrators in children's literature. You can find all that out and more. And if you're an author, you absolutely want to click the author's click here button at the top of the page to find out how we can help you celebrate your book to the world. You don't want to miss it. Check it out today. readingwithyourkids.com. Something there for everyone. Join us right now from Cornwall in the United Kingdom. Our guest is here today to celebrate her wonderful picture book. It's called Please Stay Here, I Want You Near. Please welcome to the show Dr. Sarah Katherine Mundy. Dr. Sarah, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Sarah is speaking to us from the place where so many people, so many of us parents spend so much time, the van, on the way to collect your kids. So I want to thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell us all about Please Stay Here, I Want You Near.
Well, Please Stay Here, I Want You Near is part of a bigger series called Bartley's books. As a clinical psychologist, what I've noticed through my work is when you help children make sense of their experiences, primarily through storytelling, they cope with the world much better. So what I decided to do was write a series of books for 2 to 4 year olds, who we often do to rather than talk with, to help them make sense of things that are quite often tricky. So the first in the series, Please Stay Here, I Want You Near, is about separation anxiety. And any parents out there will know that nearly all children struggle with separation anxiety. It's an absolutely normal developmental thing, but it's really hard, both for parents and for children. So Please Stay Here, I Want You Near features Bartley the bear, who's the character throughout all of the stories, and a little squirrel called Nudge. And it tells the story of a bear going to school, feeling anxious about leaving his mum helping him with it, and talking through some ways to cope with it. But what these books do, all of the books in the stories, they're interactive, so they lift the flap. So under the flaps, you have the squirrel Nudge. And what it's trying to represent is a child's internal world. So it's not just what happened to Bartley, but you'll lift up the flap and Nudge will say, oh, I wonder how he was feeling. We know that we name feelings, we can help tame them. I wonder how he was feeling. And then some of them extend to, and I wonder how you'd feel in the situation. So the books are aimed to support children and parents to connect through reading, but also make sense of things that are often really tricky or often not addressed because we don't know how to address them. We just sort of dismiss them or try and get on with them, or we don't want to broach them because we don't want to open a can of worms. So they're based on my experiences as a psychologist and drawing on psychological theory to help children with their emotional well-being, really.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about what you said, that oftentimes we do to instead of talk with our kids?
Well, historically, lots of the parenting advice has been, if they're naughty, put them in the corner. If they're naughty, give them time out. But actually what we know is naughtiness is generally a child struggling, expressing big feelings. And what they need is for you to sit with them, explore with them. And that's the only way we're going to help them make sense of what's going on and help them learn ways to cope with it. And I think early on, we expected far too much of little ones, of 2 to 5 year olds, and their brain is just not developed enough to cope on their own. So if you say, you're being naughty, go and do this, it's not going to work. They're not going to find ways to make sense of their experiences and find ways to cope. So actually what we need to do is create a narrative. And what we know is that a coherent narrative, so an organised story, is really good for our mental health. If we can say, oh, this happened because of this, we can predict what's going to happen next. We can make sense of what's happened. We can link our feelings and our experiences. And that's one way to be more positive in our mental health. It's really important for us.
Yeah. It sounds, we've talked a lot here on the podcast about, especially with our older kids, that, talking about a story, talking about an issue by talking about a story is easier. Kids have an easier time talking about those issues because they're not talking about me and my issues. They're talking about this character's issues and what's going on with them. But it sounds like you're taking that a step further. It sounds like there's some actual kind of brain science-y kind of thing that we learn better through stories, that the story, our brain is able to take those lessons and deal with them and absorb them better when we learn them through stories instead of a rule.
Well, we're meaning makers, aren't we? Humans are meaning makers. That's how we understand our lives. That's how we predict the future. That's how we make sense of the world. So stories help that, be it a story about someone else or a story about ourselves. And what I've done is almost done it 2-layered, as you said. So there's a story of this little Bartley bear experiencing things, which is quite helpful for a child to go, oh, other people might feel nervous. Quite helpful for a child to see how other people cope. But then there's also the option to think about themselves. Now, little ones don't have very advanced thinking skills. They're not very reflective. They're not really great at making sense of theirs or other people's minds because they're not quite there yet in their cognitive development. But this is a start of it. And what I use is a model called the PACE model, which is a model of parenting to support the development of attachment relationships, so to help you feel secure with your parents. And one of the components of that is curiosity. So what I'm very careful to do in the prompter questions, the lift the flap questions, isn't to say, tell me what you did, why did you do this? Those sort of questions that make you feel defensive, but to say, I wonder if you've ever felt like that, or how come, or what would that be like for you? So I think you can ask children about their own experiences, but you have to do it outside of the moment of the big feelings, because children can't think when they're having big feelings. And also you need to do it with genuine curiosity rather than sort of accusatory. Why did you throw that spoon on the floor? So one of the books, Stop That Now, I Don't Know How, is about Bartley having a meltdown, an angry outburst because his dad asks him to go to the shops. And what I'm really careful to do there is make it fun and engaging to explore feelings without saying anger is bad, because anger's not bad. But what we need to do is make sense of it and find ways to cope with it.
There might be a parent or a grandparent out there my age. I'm approaching 100 years old. And, they might be thinking, oh, this takes so much time. Just tell the kid to shut up and do what they... What would you say to that parent?
Well, it depends whether you want to, in the short term, nip something in the bud through being quite punishing, or whether in the long term you want to help your child cope with their world. And actually, if we cope with our feelings from early on, life is much easier, and therefore behaviour is much easier, therefore relationships are much easier. So actually, if we start early on, we're going to be doing ourselves a favour in the long term. It's going to be much less work in the long term, because we're going to be giving children permission to think about their feelings. We're going to be helping them understand that feelings are valid and that we all have them and that that's okay. So for me, it's actually much quicker to do this if we're thinking about the long term as parents. If we're just thinking about those 10 minutes when a child's throwing a spoon on the floor and we just want to stop them to doing it, then we can, but we're not then addressing the feelings that are underlying the behaviour. We're just looking at the behaviour. And what I'm trying to do in these books with the flaps is basically showing parents and children that there's something underlying. What's going on in their internal worlds? What's happening with their feelings? What are they thinking? What are their wishes, their desires? Not just what's this behaviour and how can I stop them clinging to my leg because it's embarrassing and I need to get to work?
You know, I think one of the things that we forget to consider is that the brain of a 5-year-old is different than our brain. That brain is still developing. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how kids that age are seeing the world?
Absolutely. So our brain develops sort of upwards. So we start off relying on the bottom part of our brain, which is much more our survival system, which is why babies cry when they want, when they need something. They're just like an overflow of emotions, aren't they? They don't have any logical, rational thinking. So it takes time for us to develop those connections from the bottom part of the brain, which is the more emotional, survival, in the moment, to the top part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the more logical, thinking, rational part. So not only does that take time, but when we're stressed, Dan Siegel, if anyone's interested, Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson have written a book called The Whole Brain Child that's just fantastic, explains this beautifully. But even if we've got some of those connections, when we're stressed, I'm doing a hand signal now, and then I suddenly remembered that we're actually on a podcast, but we flip our lid. So it might be that we have the skills to problem solve, but if we're having really big problems, if we're having really big feelings, we're relying on the bottom part, which is a less rational, emotional, I just want to get out of here, this is stressful, which is why parents need to lend their, hopefully, more rational, calm and controlled part of the brain to their children to help them reconnect. So we talk about flipping your lid when you're having big feelings, and you then focus on the bottom survival part of the brain, and we need to help children reconnect those parts of the brain. Yeah. Does that make sense? I'm not a neuroscientist. Just want to qualify that.
No. It does, and I think it's important for us to understand that. I mean, all of us understand how hard it is when we're frustrated and when we're dealing with big feelings. But I think we forget that, we've had 30, 40, almost 100 years experience dealing with all these different feelings, whereas a 5-year-old, this may be the first time they're dealing with this particular feeling, and oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with it.
I don't know what it is. And until we can identify what we're feeling, it's quite hard on our own to know how to manage it. Mm-hmm. And so not only do they have those big feelings, probably bigger feelings, but they don't have the connections within their brain to calm themselves. So an adult's role is to lend their brain, their frontal lobe, to their children. And that's not just when they're babies. I think about, don't know exactly, but 90% of growth of the brain is in the first 3 years. And, it keeps growing. It's not until 25 that our prefrontal, and they're pushing our buttons because it's quite exhausting. So, we might flip our lids too. And part of the stories, so in the angry story, when Bartley gets angry, Dad tries really hard to keep it together, but he does get a bit cross and a bit shouty. But what he then does is repairs, and he says, I'm sorry I'm shouting. I didn't notice. He calms himself down, and only then can he help Bartley manage his own anger, manage his own big feelings.
Yeah. How important is that for a parent, and it can be very difficult, but how important is it for a parent when they make a mistake, when they lose it, and they kind of fly off the handle, to apologize and to talk to their kids about, hey, I'm sorry, I was frustrated, I didn't know what to do, I was scared for you, I was afraid you were going to get hurt, and that's why I flipped out. How important is it for...
That's beautifully said, because firstly what we're doing is we're owning our feelings, and we're owning the fact that we made a mistake. We're demonstrating it's okay to make mistakes. Secondly, we're making sense of it for the child, because if we don't make sense of it for the child, children start to experience themselves as bad. I am bad, I've done something wrong, and that's when shame starts building. And actually, when we're doing that, we're deepening that attachment relationship, that connection. We're owning it. There's going to be ruptures. We have to set boundaries. Children are going to feel shame for a bit, but as soon as we can get in and go, oh, I'm sorry, I still love you, what you did wasn't okay. I didn't want you to touch that fire because you'd hurt yourself. And I'm sorry I shouted. I was trying to keep you safe. We're deepening that security. We're helping children feel more secure with us. They know we've got their back. They know people make mistakes, and they know that we can hold our hands up, and it's not because they're bad. It's because they had to intervene, but they're still okay and they're still lovable. Yeah. So it's key. For me, that's key to pretty much any parenting, and I quite like it because we can't be perfect parents. We just need to notice when we've made a mistake and hold our hands up and just accept responsibility. You know, that's okay. We make mistakes.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the advice when young parents ask me for advice. It's always get yourself down off that pedestal. You know, your kids
Absolutely.
think that you're perfect. You want to climb off that pedestal as soon as possible.
Absolutely, because we're learning about being parents, aren't we? And inevitably, when you learn anything, you make mistakes along the way. And we need to own them like we do in any other area of life. And then we're teaching children that we respect them as individuals. And we're sort of, children are sponges. They will start to learn what we're showing them. So if we're showing them respect, and if we're showing them that it's not about power, and if we're showing them that people make mistakes, we're doing a lot to support the development of their character, really. And that's going to help them no end in the world. You know, if you think about people that you work with or your friends, it's those that own up to their mistakes, or those that say, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that you like spending time with, you feel safe around. And so much of it is about feeling safe and secure with people, knowing it's not us and, you know, me versus you, it's us. Let's work on this together. Yeah. I made a mistake, or you could do that differently. I mean, that's what a relationship is, really. It's two-way.
So what I hear you saying is we should probably never rely on the expression, because I said so, when we're parenting.
Well, I must admit, I did the other day, how dare you talk to your mother like that? And then I just thought, that's so unhelpful. You know, what is that teaching my son? You know, that I demand respect. For what? Because we had a little fallout and he was rude to me. No, I need to help him work out how that doesn't happen again, and let him know that I'm still there for him, but please don't talk to me like that. But then, you know, we often go back into, and that was a template of my father saying that to me. So we often go back into those, we talk about internal working models. So templates that we've learned from when we were younger that then guide how we are. And they often come into play, well, they come into play in all relationships, but there can be really obvious in parenting, because you actually hear your parents' voice parroting in your head and you think, I was never going to do that. Why did I do that? So they're sort of unconscious, and they come out, and know then they're sometimes helpful because we have positive internal working models, but they can sometimes be really unhelpful. So yet again, it's about reflecting on that, noticing that, and owning that. So what we know about parenting is one of the biggest predictors of children feeling secure is a parent's ability to, there's so much psychobabble, but to mentalize. So to understand that we have their ability to reflect on their own internal world and on their child's internal world, and know that they're different people and they have different experiences. And if we can do that and step into children's shoes, it's much easier to get it right. It's much easier to empathise with them. And it's much easier not to get pulled into this, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and this power battle that can so often happen.
I like that word. I have to go back and listen again, because I want to be able to use mentalize in conversations.
Yeah. It's Peter Fonagy. No, he didn't develop the term, but he's done a lot of work on it. He was my tutor when I was doing my doctorate 20 odd years ago. But he talks a lot about it, and he talks about it really beautifully. So have a look at Peter Fonagy. It's mentalization, but it's also called different terms. Dan Siegel calls it mind sight, I think. Other people call it mindedness. There's always got to be a bit of jargon, and everybody's got to have their own term for it. But it's basically the understanding that we have internal worlds, and that ours might be different to other people's. And if we look at that rather than just the outward behaviour, we're going to be much more successful in supporting what's actually driving the behaviour.
Dr. Sarah, why are you here? I mean, I just love this conversation. When I started the Reading with Your Kids podcast almost 6 years ago, I started for a very specific reason. since we had the show, I've discovered that there are so many benefits of reading with our kids. I mean, kids develop vocabulary. They hear so many more words. They're able to talk about feelings, and studies show that kids who are read to make more money in their professional lives as they grow up. But I started the podcast because I knew that the relationship that I have now with my now 27 and 29-year-old kids started when they were on my lap and we're reading together.
Absolutely.
The fact that we are able to have these conversations. Can you back me up on that bond is so very, very important that we're building with our kids as we're reading with them?
Absolutely. And I think it's on your website. It's about connecting, because you're not just reading a book, you're building stories together, you're experiencing it together, you're being together. And I think when life is so busy, we can miss that connecting time. And so, yes, it's about exploring adventures, developing vocabulary, having emotions, but it's also about building relationships. And it's absolutely key, I think. I still try, he doesn't really let me, but I still try and go and read a bit of my 13-year-old's book with him most nights. So every night I read to my 5-year-old, my 11-year-old, and then when he'll let me in his room, my 13-year-old. Because you're right, it is about having that. And it's time that you can be together without any competing demands. And I think particularly with such a busy world, we can forget to do that. And I think it's hugely important in just being together. Yeah. Hugely important.
And how comforting and reassuring must it be to be talking about these big feelings that kids don't know about when they're on their parents' lap, when they're lying together in bed or sitting together on a couch. Just that physical connection.
Yeah, I'm interested in you. I can help you with this. You're not bad because you felt angry. I don't appreciate it when you chuck something over or when you bite your brother, but I'm trying to help you with it. That message is so strong. I'm there for you. I've got you. And I think often outside of the home, there's lots of messages. I quite often despair when I'm at the school gates where you see, not so much anymore, but you see sort of a child being prized off. Don't be silly, you'll be fine, in you come, without actually just validating this is really hard. Or when you do that, you go, they still have it in some schools in the UK and probably in the US, but you go to removal or exclusion because you're struggling and you've behaved badly. So the message is you can't express big feelings and you can't, you have to cope on your own. And actually what we're doing by sitting down and reading and exploring big feelings is we're saying, we can help you with big feelings. You're not on your own. They're absolutely normal. And it's okay to come back to something that's been difficult because we know that in the moment you couldn't cope with it. And that's absolutely fine. There's no point in talking when you flipped your lid. But there is point in talking about it later. And I'm here to help you work it out because I'm yet to meet a child who wants to have angry outbursts. No one likes it. It's not pleasant, is it?
No.
So it's actually saying I'm here to help you with it.
Yeah. You're right. And I love the expression when you flip your lid and you blow up. I don't want to eat for hours, and I like to eat all the time.
Exactly.
This is really, Dr. Sarah, I need to put this out there. You have a bunch of books. I'd love to have you back on because I love this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to. Absolutely.
And until then, tell everybody, please, where they can go to find out more about Please Stay Here, I Want You Near, and all of your great books.
Oh, and I just to mention that I have done a brief parenting handbook. A very brief parenting handbook, because I know we don't have time to read, just to explain the theories behind the books, the importance of storytelling, the attachment relationship, emotional development, with sort of top tips at the end of that, and also top tips at the end of each children's book. So they're for parents just as much as children. So at the moment they're available on Amazon, but only in the UK. But if people follow my Instagram, which is Parenting Through Stories, I'm regularly, and they just send me a message, I'm regularly shipping them out. I think they're in 15 or 16 different countries now. So they can just DM me and I will pop them in the post. And I generally do a discount if they're international buyers, because obviously postage is not as cheap as just sending it within the UK. So yes, and I regularly post on my Instagram about emotional development, about parenting, mainly about little ones, about the early years, but I sometimes broaden out across the board, because clinically I work with sort of up to 21-year-olds and lots of parents. So
that's a lot. We've had a really eye-opening time speaking to the author of Please Stay Here, I Want You Near, Dr. Sarah Katherine Mundy. Dr. Sarah, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a great chat. I'd love to come back.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest would be Brittany Wynn Lee. She'll be here to celebrate Good Night Body, finding calm from head to toe. It's a really interesting conversation. I had so much fun with Brittany. I think you're going to have a lot of fun, too. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our guest, Dr. Sarah Katherine Mundy. Please be sure to check out her great series, especially her book, Please Stay Here, I Want You Near. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Jordan Saley, Stephanie Davila, Will Cheever, Cassandra Messonnet. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.